Hope you guys are having a great Monday. So, really excited to talk about today's topic, which is should you be tracking calories or should you be tracking your macros or macronutrients? So, you might be somebody just getting started with your fitness journey. You might have a goal of losing weight, losing body fat, improving your body composition, or maybe you just have a goal of overall like feeling better and improving your performance in the gym. Maybe it's not about how you look or how your body physically changes, but maybe you just want to feel stronger and make sure you're eating enough and eating the right things to see progress in that area. And if you are somebody who has started out, you've probably, you maybe tried a variety of things, right? Weight Watchers, keto, intermittent fasting, whatever it is. And along the road, you've probably heard of people talking about tracking calories, tracking macros, which one you should do, which one is better for progress, what are the pros and cons of each, and so on. So we're going to dive into that today. We're going to dive into what the difference is, what's better, and what I recommend you do to get started with this. So first off, tracking calories. Kind of self-explanatory. Most of us have probably heard of a calorie and probably know in general like what a calorie is. But simply put, tracking calories is basically tracking the amount of energy you are intaking through food. So when we eat food, we extract what's called calories from it, and basically it is a unit to measure the amount of energy coming in. And if we get kind of like scientific around it, it's how much energy is required to heat like so much water to this temperature or whatever, but basically it's how much energy our body is taking in. And the reason why this number is important when it comes to weight loss or fat loss or our fitness journeys is because it's the one metric that we need to be controlling in some way to see weight loss when it comes to like tissue mass. And what I mean by tissue mass is losing fat or muscle. And it's really important that I make this distinction because you can lose weight on the scale and it could just be entirely just water weight. That's what a lot of these like cleanses do, these different shakes that you take that flush out your system or whatever. A lot of times even keto, that's what keto does, where you drop your carbs way down and you end up losing a lot of water weight because your carbs are coming down because water is typically stored with carbs in the body. Same thing with sodium. If you drop your sodium way down, you're probably going to see a lot of weight loss too, but it's not necessarily going to be fat loss. It's going to be a lot of water weight. So we can lose weight without it actually being like tissue mass. So when I'm talking about calories being like the number one metric we have to somehow control when it comes to weight loss, I'm talking about actual like tissue mass. So you're losing actual fat, like body fat tissue, or you're losing possibly muscle mass tissue too. So tracking calories is obviously like very simple when it comes to like tracking macros versus tracking calories, because tracking calories, you're just tracking one specific number, right? You're getting an idea of how many calories you burn, and you are picking a number that, is a little bit less than that, and you are choosing to eat that if your goal is fat loss. If your goal is to maintain your weight, you want to equal that, right? We want to be in calorie balance to where our calories that we eat are equal to the calories that we burn. And then if we want to actually gain weight, in some circumstances, because we do have some clients who they need to and want to actually gain weight to build muscle because they're already pretty lean. Those clients, they want to eat a little bit more calories than what they burn. But overall, we have to manipulate that calorie balance to lose fat tissue, or to lose tissue in general. So like I said, it's very simple. We're just tracking one individual thing. And this makes it very appealing for a lot of people because it's just one specific number to keep track of, right? Especially if you're just getting started, like making all of these shifts, starting to track your food intake in general if you've never done this, starting to go to the gym if you've been somebody who's never really consistently exercised, or starting to maybe track your steps when you're somebody who just typically sits at their desk all day for work and you don't actively go on walks. All of those are like so many different lifestyle changes you're trying to make, along with you're probably changing your food sources too, overall trying to just generally eat kind of common sense healthier foods or whole foods. That's a lot to change in your life. So tracking just calories is very appealing because it's just one number that you have to keep track of, along with all those other things that you're changing. Um, it's also very helpful to just track calories. Excuse me, because the information is very accessible for most foods. Like it's very easy to just go online and search how many calories in this, 4 ounces of this, and you're going to find numbers that pop up. So it's very easy to find calorie intake numbers. The only thing only scenario where it could be difficult to find how many calories are in a food item is if you are eating at like a local restaurant. So not a chain place, but a local place. And a lot of those local places, they don't have their nutrition info online. That would be the only case. But even then, you can look for like the calorie content of a similar item from a more chain place and estimate it that way. Like, for example, we have a Mexican restaurant that is like 2 minutes down the road from where we live, and we go there often, and there's this burrito that I get all the time there. And every time I eat there and I track it, I just track my Chipotle burrito. Now, is it going to be the exact same? No. Is it going to be probably close? Yeah. Is it going to be better than me just like not tracking anything at all? Yeah. So that's how I kind of manipulate that. And you could do the same thing with like local pizza places versus chain pizza places too. And I do that as well. But overall, finding the calorie content of foods is typically pretty easy to find, especially with all the resources we have. The food trackers, MyFitnessPal, online, the websites, and things like that. And like I said, it's not overwhelming or not as overwhelming at least compared to tracking full-on macros, because it's just one number that you are shooting for when it comes to nutrition at least. So let's dive into tracking macros then, right? So we talked about calories, what it is. We're tracking the amount of energy that we are eating through food, and that's kind of the sole number, and that is the most important number when it comes to if we're going to lose tissue mass. So if we're going to lose fat mass or muscle mass, making our body overall smaller tissue-wise, we need to be eating less calories than what we burn. So tracking macros. So this is where I think a lot of people get confused as to like, people are like, well, what's the difference? Why do I need to track macros? What does tracking macros even mean? Like, I think a lot of people have tried tracking macros from the get-go before ever tracking calories, and maybe even before really paying attention to their nutrition at all or learning anything about nutrition. And it can be very overwhelming because you're like, okay, I have this protein, I have this carb and fat goal, and if I eat more protein, then my carbs are going to be low. If I eat more carbs, then my fat's going to be low. If I eat too much fat, then my carbs are here. And it's like playing a really complicated game of Tetris if it's something that you're not familiar with. So hopefully, as I break this down, it'll be a little bit easier for you to at least like comprehend like what it means to track macros, and then you can kind of base your decision on if you want to go that route or not. So tracking macros is going to be a little bit more complex than tracking calories, simply because you're tracking 3 different nutrients versus just one number. So if you're tracking macros, you're going to be tracking protein, you're going to be tracking carbohydrates, and you're going to be tracking fat. So you're going to be tracking 3 separate nutrients. Maybe alcohol is going to be in there, but typically when people track macros, they kind of incorporate alcohol as a carbon and fat, but we're not going to get into that in this video today. But most people are tracking protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Those are your 3 macros, or the actual official term is macronutrients. And the reason why they're called macronutrients is because our bodies require these or consume these in large amounts, right? You've probably heard the term macronutrients and micronutrients. Micronutrients are the vitamins and minerals that we get from food. So like vitamin D, E, A, D, E, and K, minerals that we get. So like calcium, sodium, potassium, iron, all of those are lumped into micronutrients because we consume them in very small amounts compared to macronutrients. So if you look at macronutrients, they are labeled in grams. Micronutrients are typically labeled in milligrams, so a much smaller amount. And also macronutrients, so the protein, carbs, and fats that we consume in high amounts, those are where we actually get all of our calories from. unless you have alcohol, but we're not going to include that because it's not like a necessary source of calories for survival. But protein, carbs, and fats are where we get all of our calories from, actually. So if you were to, well, let me just kind of back up a little bit. So protein and carbs are measured in grams along with fat. Protein, carbs, and fats are all measured in grams. If you look at a nutrition label, you're going to see like the calorie content of the food item and the serving size and things. But if you look at how much protein, carbs, and fat are in that food item, you're going to see a G or a gram next to that on the nutrition label. So they are measured in grams. So like I said, when you are, or we get all of our calories from our food from protein, carbs, and fat. So if you look at the food label, it's going to be measured in grams. And protein and carbohydrates, both of those two macronutrients contain 4 calories per gram. So for every gram of protein you eat, you're going to get 4 calories from that. For every gram of carbohydrate you eat, you're going to get 4 calories from that. So if you have a food item and let's say it contains nothing but 20 grams of protein, that's the only thing, doesn't include any carbohydrates or fats, you're going to get 4 calories for each of those 20 grams of protein. 20 grams of protein times 4 calories per gram. That food item is going to have 80 total calories in it. And the same thing would be true if it has just 20 grams of carbs. 20 grams of carbs times 4, it's going to have 80 calories in it. Now, if you have a food item that has 20 grams of carbs plus 20 grams of protein, but 0 fat, then it's going to get 4 calories per gram for both of those. So it's going to have 160 calories total in that food item. So that's protein and carbs. Fat contains 9 calories per gram. So the amount in grams of fat is a little bit more than double than the in calories than the amount of calories you get from a gram of protein and carbs. But you can see how knowing this information and knowing alcohol excluded, if a food item has, 10 grams of protein, 10 grams of carbs, 10 grams of fat, we can use this knowledge of knowing it has 4 calories per gram for protein and carbs, and then also 9 calories per gram for fat. We can use that to calculate the total calorie intake of that food item. So if it was 10, 10, and 10, so 10 grams of protein, 10 grams of carbs, and 10 grams of fat, you're going to get 40 calories from protein in that food. So, 10 grams of protein times 4 calories per gram. You're going to get 40 calories of carbs in that food. So 10 grams of carbs times 4 calories per gram when it comes to carbs. So that's going to be 80 total calories with protein and carbs. Now fat, like I said, is 9 calories per gram. So if that food item has 10 grams of fat in it, you're going to get 90 calories from those grams of fat. So the 80 calories that you're getting from the 10 grams of protein plus the 10 grams of carbs, plus the 90 calories you're going to get from the 10 grams of fat, that food item is going to have a total of 170 calories in it. So hopefully that was pretty easy to follow. 10 grams of protein, 10 grams of carbs, 10 grams of fat. Protein and carbs are 4 calories per gram. Fat is 9 calories per gram. So if you just know the macros of something, you like don't have the nutrition label, and somebody just told you this food item has 10 grams of this, 10 grams of carbs, 10 grams of fat, you could actually calculate the total calorie intake of that food, even though nobody told you what the calorie intake is. But just from using that math, you could find out what the total calorie content is. So with that, if you are tracking macros, right? Like if somebody were to give you a macro goal of, okay, you're going to aim for 100 grams of protein, 200 grams of carbs, and 50 grams of fat, you are actually indirectly still tracking calories because all of those things kind of equal each other out if you add them together, right? So this is kind of the analogy that I like to use to kind of explain the difference between tracking calories and macros. Tracking, like let's say if you were trying to really budget things out and you wanted to track your total, or you wanted to track your expenses each month. If you were to track, like add up all of your expenses and track your total expenses each month and be like, okay, each month with like just everything that we spend, you just take a snapshot of your bank account of like how much money is going out every single month. And on average, we're spending, I don't know, random number, $3,000 a month or whatever. That could be low, high, whatever it is, depending on your situation. But let's just throw out $3,000 a month. That's what your expenses are each month. You see that going out of your account. That would be like tracking calories, right? You're tracking the total amount of expenses that are going out, or the total amount of something going out, or it could be coming into. You could be tracking maybe your income, right? You could be tracking the amount of money total coming in between all of your streams of revenue. Let's say, you have multiple streams of revenue. You have you're self-employed. You also have a part-time job on the side. You also have like investments you make or whatever. You're tracking all of your income coming in. That would be like your total calories you're tracking that are coming in. Now, that would be total calories, like I said. Tracking macros would be like tracking the individual sources of income that you have coming in. So you're tracking how much are you bringing in from your own business, like self-employed. How much are you bringing in through investments? How much are you bringing in specifically from your part-time job? And you're keeping track of those numbers and monitoring how those numbers from those categories change. And same could be said for expenses. You could be lumping your expenses into different categories, like, okay, this is our food or grocery expense. This is our utility expense. This is our fun, quote unquote, expense, things you do for fun. You could have those 3 different expense categories and throwing all of your expenses in there, and then being like, okay, we spent, $800 on food and groceries this month total. We spent, $500 on quote unquote fun this month, and we spent this much on utilities this month. Let's try to bring just utilities down, but keep, the expenses and or the expenses from fun and groceries the same. Or maybe you want to bring down the food expense because you guys have been getting DoorDash way too often this month. My wife and I. You could bring down your grocery and food expense, but keep your utilities and your fun expenses the same, right? And that would overall help you save money. So hopefully that analogy kind of helped you to get the gist of the difference. Tracking calories is the equivalent of tracking all of your expenses total throughout the month. Tracking macros is like tracking these different categories of your expenses and then manipulating them from there. Obviously, if you're tracking 3 different categories of things, it's going to be a little bit more complex. But it does allow you to control for a few different things, right? It allows you to control for those specific categories. So you can control for your individual protein intake. So if you're tracking macros, you know how many grams of protein you're getting in. So you know if you're getting enough protein, which is super important for keeping and building muscle and muscle recovery from your workouts. You also are able to obviously keep tabs on your carb intake if you're tracking your macros, which is super important to get in enough carbs, but also it can be beneficial to have a consistent carbohydrate intake each day just for fueling performance. So you have the same kind of energy level every time you step in the gym. And then also tracking carbs and having that consistent can lead to you having a more consistent fiber intake, because we do get fiber from carbs, which helps with blood cholesterol control, helps with us feeling full, helps with regular bowel movements, super beneficial for overall health. So that's a benefit as well. And then also, if you're tracking macros, you're able to keep tabs on your total fat intake each day. So fat is super important to make sure we're getting enough of it for, and I mean dietary fat. Super important to make sure we're getting enough of it for proper hormone production, hormone regulation. If you are eating a super low fat intake per day, like if you're having less than 40 grams per day consistently, you definitely run the risk of your hormones kind of getting out of whack and your hormone production slowing down. Various hormones, especially sex hormones, that really help with energy production throughout the day. So we don't want our fat intake to get too low as well. So by tracking macros, it's a little bit more complex, a little bit more time consuming, but it does allow us to control for protein, carbs, and fats, control for those specific categories that can have beneficial effects when it comes to like fat loss, building muscle, overall health, energy levels, and things like that. So now that we kind of went over the difference between tracking calories and tracking macros, what should you do? And this is like obviously the $1 million question, right? Like you have all this information, like what should you do? Or if you're asking yourself this, what should I do to see the best results and to make sure I'm covering all my bases? So my recommendation is I would start with whatever feels the least overwhelming to you. So maybe that's just starting with just calories for now, right? Like whatever you start with doesn't have to be what you end with. And just keep that in mind. Like I think people think like they, want to lose weight or they want to get better health or they want to do this. And they're like, okay, this is tracking macros is optimal, right? That's the perfect formula, right? I can control for all these things, but you don't have to start with optimal. You can start with just better than what you're doing right now, which if you're not tracking anything right now, just tracking calories is a big step. So start with maybe just calories and get used to that, get consistent with that. And maybe as you track calories, start to look at foods and think like, okay, this is kind of high in protein. This is kind of high in carbs. This is kind of high in fat. And that way, like as you're just starting simply with tracking calories, you're kind of learning how many grams of protein, carbs, and fats are in foods. So if down the road you end up switching to tracking macros, you kind of have already a base knowledge of the composition of foods, and then it will make hitting those individual 3 separate goals a lot easier. And maybe you start with just calories and protein too. Maybe you feel like just calories is a little bit too simple for you maybe. So you want to take it that next step. That next step would be to track calories and protein. And this is actually where most of our clients start off with. They start off with just a calorie and a protein goal because we don't want to overwhelm them with just starting them off with full-on macros. And also, when we look at the research, for a lot of people, the carbohydrate and fat intake that they consume doesn't really make much of a difference when it comes to fat loss for the majority of people. And that's because calories are going to dictate if you, like I said in the beginning of this, it dictates if you lose tissue, whether it be fat or muscle. And then protein is going to dictate if we are able to retain our muscle. So if we are retaining 100% of our muscle as we lose body tissue because we're eating enough protein, then that means all the body tissue we lose is basically going to be fat. So manipulating calories, tracking calories controls for tissue loss, body tissue loss, where accounting for protein ensures that the weight we do lose in tissue is going to be fat loss. So those are the 2 big variables. If you're going to focus on 2 things, I would focus on calories and protein to start, and then maybe down the road, add in like a carbohydrate and fat range, which kind of leads me to what I want to mention next is when you track these, 100% aim for ranges. Don't just aim for specific numbers. This is a big mistake I see a lot of people make is they go online, type in their information into a calculator or whatever, and it spits out, okay, I need to eat 1,800 calories a day. And they're like, okay, 1,800 is my calorie number. If I don't hit 1,800, then I'm going to stress out. I'm going to feel like a failure. And maybe I hit 1,780, but I'm 20 calories off. Let me try to like look in my pantry for something that's 20 calories. Don't do that. Aim for ranges instead. What we use with our clients is typically a 140 to 150 calorie range, somewhere around there. So if your goal, like let's say if you put into a calculator or somebody who is educated told you your calorie goal was 1,800, aim for between 1,725 and 1,875. That's going to give you a 150 calorie range with the 1,800 goal falling smack dab in the middle. But having that range gives you more flexibility to where like you're still getting close to that goal, but you're giving yourself enough flexibility to where you're not stressing out if you're like 20, 25 calories short, because that's silly. 20 to 25 calories in its own is not going to make like any difference in your progress at all. So having those ranges just makes it way more practical. And then also when it comes to protein, make sure you have a protein range too. Don't just aim for a specific number of grams of protein. Like don't just aim for 120 grams of protein. Some people will tell you, like I've seen some coaches online talk about the ranges, and their ranges are like 5 grams. Like their range is like 120 to 125. my opinion is have a bigger range than that. 120 to 125 is a small enough range where you basically might as well not even have a range. So I recommend a 20 gram protein range. So if your goal is 120, aim for between 110 and 130. So that also, like I said, just allows you enough flexibility to just not stress about like, minuscule grams. Like if you're 7 grams short on your protein, like my opinion, like if you're full and you don't feel like eating more and it's the end of the day, like don't be going through your cabinets at 11:59 p.m. trying to squeeze in 7 grams more protein before midnight hits and the day resets. Like don't do that. So 150 calorie range, and then a 20 gram protein range. And some people can do well on just calories and protein literally forever. Some people can eat just calories or track just calories and protein and continuously lose weight for, months, even a year or more. I've had multiple clients who have lost 30 plus pounds, and they've done this over a span of 6 months to a year. And we've literally only focused on calories and protein, and we haven't implemented any carbohydrate and fat range. So you don't have to go the carbohydrate and fat route. But I will say the more advanced you get, I probably recommend being conscious of at least of your carbohydrate and fat range, just to have it in the back of your head, because we just want to make sure our fat intake, for one, doesn't get too low. And then also there are obviously some benefits of having a consistent carbohydrate and fat intake too. So once you kind of get down tracking calories, once you get down hitting your calorie and protein goal, moving on to a carbohydrate and fat range too is something that I recommend just kind of having in the back of your head and being conscious of. And it's something that you don't have to stress about hitting exactly every single day. But on most days, I'd recommend trying to get close to it. And the ranges that we typically use with clients with carbs, if we give them a carb range, it's usually at like a 30 gram carb range. So if their carbs might be between 200 and 230 grams, that could be their range. And then with fat, usually we do like a 20 gram fat range. Like maybe their fat goal is between 50 and 70 or between 60 and 80. But those are just the ranges we use to give you some flexibility, but to keep things in a relative ballpark. But if you do implement a carbohydrate and fat range, don't let hitting that carb and fat range deter you or complicate things to where you end up missing your calorie and protein range, because calorie and proteins are 100% the most important two things to track and to hit, and then carbohydrate and fat are kind of your close second two things to track. But the reason why we would potentially move from just tracking calories and protein to tracking calories, protein, and then having like a rough carb and fat range in the back of our head too is because it can help with consistent recovery and energy from the gym. So when we eat carbohydrates, we store them in two main places. We store them in our liver as glycogen, and that helps to regulate our blood sugar. But we also store carbohydrates in our muscle as what's called glycogen. And this is used for performance in the gym, for our lifting, for even our running, for our endurance, for our cardio. If you are working out and you're using like short energy sources like that, like you need immediate energy as you're lifting weights or working out, that energy is coming from the glycogen in your muscles. So if we have a carbohydrate intake where, some days it's super high, some days it's super low, some days it's super high again, then it's super low. If our carbohydrate intake is constantly going up and down, when we go to the gym, we're not going to go to the gym consistently. If we're going to the gym 4 days a week, we're not going to have consistent energy levels for each of those workouts, because we just, some days, Monday, you might have 150 grams of carbs stored as glycogen in your muscle to use for your workout. And then Thursday rolls around, and if your carbohydrate intake was super low on Wednesday, you might only have 30 grams of carbs stored as glycogen in your muscle for that workout. So if our carbohydrate intake is super inconsistent, our energy levels in the gym are probably going to be super inconsistent too. So that's one benefit to having this kind of rough carbohydrate and fat range in the back of our head, is because, if we're hitting our carbohydrate range, we're going to have consistent energy levels there. Also, another benefit of having this rough carbohydrate range is consistent fullness. So like I mentioned earlier, we get fiber from carbohydrates, from like things like whole grains, oatmeal, fruits, vegetables. We get fiber from carbohydrate, and fiber is really beneficial for helping us to stay full throughout the day and full in between meals. So if similar situation, kind of, if we have one day that's super high in carbs and super high in fiber, we're going to feel really full that day, which is going to be beneficial for fat loss. But if the next day, if our carbohydrate intake is super low because our fat intake is super high, then our fiber intake is probably going to be low as well, which means we're going to have less fiber to keep us full that day, and we might have higher hunger levels then. So by having a consistent carbohydrate intake, it allows for our gym sessions, our energy in our gym sessions to maybe be a little bit more predictable. And then also allows us for our hunger to maybe be a little bit more predictable throughout the day. And then also, like I said, obviously the fat intake, keeping that at a consistent range is super important to make sure like our hormone production stays consistent and stays in an optimal range as well. So that's kind of how or why tracking calories and protein and having a rough carbohydrate and fat range in the back of your head too can be beneficial. Now, like I said, you don't have to hit this every day. But most days, especially routine days, probably try to have those close to those ranges at least that you have set. So one thing too to remember with this is you can bounce between the two depending on your situation as well. Like some days or weeks you can track just calories. Some days or weeks you can track calories and protein. Some days or weeks you can track calories, protein, and have the carbohydrate and fat range in the back of your head. You can, switch back and forth depending on what's going on in your life or what situation you're in, what environment you're in. For example, if you're on vacation versus if you're at home. If you're at home at a very regular day, everything's a routine, everything's kind of, boom, 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 normal. Like those are good days or good weeks to hit your calorie and protein goal and still try to hit your carb and fat intake goal. Like everything's really normal, not a whole lot of outside stress, nothing's chaotic, at least more chaotic than usual. So those are really good days to kind of have all of these variables in the back of your head. But if you go on vacation, but you still want to track your food intake, maybe that's a time where you just focus on calories, or maybe you just focus on calories and protein and just don't stress about your carb and fat ranges at all. Like, for example, too, this is great for work trips or maybe just weekend getaways where you're going away, right? If you're going on a long week-long vacation and it's all-inclusive resort, my opinion, don't track your food on all-inclusive resorts. I would never do that. But if you're going on a work trip and it's for a few days, but you still want to stay on track with your nutrition, tracking just calories or just calories and protein is a great alternative versus trying to aim for all of the macros with your calories too. Another example would be if you have a very routine week or day versus a very stressful week or day. Maybe you have a very stressful week, you have a ton of work projects, you're working super late, there's a bunch of different, baseball games, softball games with your kids or sporting events or other family social events. In those scenarios, maybe just tracking calories and protein is better because it's more practical, it causes you less stress than trying to worry about all these other variables, and stick with the days that are very routine for you with hitting, your calories, protein, and your carbs and fats. Also, if you are in a fat loss phase versus a maintenance phase, if you are in a fat loss phase, you're going to be eating less calories than what you burn. So your overall energy levels are going to maybe be a little bit lower. So because your overall energy levels are going to be a little bit lower, making sure you have enough carbs to fuel your performance and your workouts is going to be really important. So maybe in fat loss phases, you get a little bit more dialed in with making sure you have, you're hitting your calories and protein, obviously, but you also are dialed in more with your carb and fat intake, because those carbs are going to be even more important to fuel your workouts when your overall calorie intake is a little bit lower. But then you go into a maintenance phase where your calories are a little bit higher, so you just have overall more energy coming in. So the carbohydrates, while they're still 100% important, they aren't maybe as important, since your overall energy is just going to be higher anyway because you're eating more food in a maintenance phase versus fat loss phase. So that's where you can manipulate what you focus on too versus what phase you're in. Like if I'm in a fat loss phase, I'm obviously hitting my calories to make sure I'm in a deficit. I'm hitting my protein to make sure I maintain my muscle, but I'm a little bit more dialed in with my carbohydrate and fat intake to make sure I'm getting enough carbs for my performance in the gym. But when I'm in a maintenance phase, or maybe I'm in a surplus, so I'm actually trying to maybe put on weight and purposely build muscle, if I'm in that phase, I'm very loose with my carb and fat intake and just kind of focus on calories and protein, because with all the extra calories I'm getting, with all the extra food, I'm not in a deficit of energy. So I'm like 99 times out of 100, I'm just automatically going to get enough carbs because my calories are so much higher, and those calories got to come from something. And it's going to be mostly filled in with carbs and fats. So I don't have to worry about those being as low. So you can change your focus based on, if you're traveling versus at home on a regular day, if you're having a stressful week versus a routine week, or if you're in a maintenance phase versus a fat loss phase. And I really think like tracking your food and doing this long term, being able to switch between those focuses based on what's going on in your life or what phase you're in, is what makes it also more sustainable long term. Because if I was always focused on all three macros all the time, protein, carbs, and fats, even in my maintenance phases or my building phases, I would probably get really burnt out with the tracking process. At least I'd get burnt out with it quicker. But because I'm able to reduce my focus a little bit during those phases, I don't get as burnt out quickly, or don't get as burnt out at all. Because the only times I'm really focused on all of those variables are when things are routine, when I'm in a fat loss phase, or when it's, very important for me to, really make sure I'm getting enough carbohydrates, if that makes sense. So those are the differences between the two. Calories, more simple. Macros, obviously more complex, but it also allows you to control for a few different things that are really important. Start with what feels least overwhelming for you and work your way up from there. And don't be afraid to, if you go on a work trip, or if you go on a vacation, or a weekend getaway, or you're having a stressful week, or maybe you're in maintenance or a surplus, don't be afraid to go backwards in your focus a little bit, and maybe dial back on the carb and fat ranges a little bit, kind of put them away from the forefront of your head or your mind, and focus on just calories, or maybe just calories and protein during those phases to help you get by, to avoid burnout. And overall, if you do that consistently, and at least at bare minimum hit your calories and protein, like, you're going to see great results long term. So hopefully this was helpful when it comes to explaining the differences between the two. If this was helpful, definitely make sure you share it with a friend. Definitely leave a like, comment. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. But yeah, that's about it for today. Let me know if you have any questions. Appreciate you all, and I will see you guys in the next one.